Hey class. All right. So we're going to break it down for this week. We're going to talk about resistance. And I think it's a very powerful thing that appreciative inquiry folks deal with and people with appreciative growth mindsets deal with all the time. So understanding it is really important. And I wanted to help you think about your appreciative inquiry interviews through this idea and delving into the realm of, you know, how do you position positivity when faced with negativity, essentially, to envision a brighter future. So you're going to encounter these clouds of negativity. It just happens. So, um, you might remember a group project that you worked on where it seemed to come from a place of complaints and cynicism, and that was the cloud. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. We've all been there. So you're armed now with the knowledge of appreciative inquiry. At this point in class, you have a deeper knowledge. So let's just kind of rewind for a little bit and kind of reimagine what this looks like when we're dealing with resistance. So before we get to that, let's talk about the bigger elephant in the room, right? So I think for the people in the consulting world, we learn these sort of, models and frameworks and the science of OD essentially. But when we come into the real world, we're sort of thrown into, uh, oh my gosh, that might not work, right? Or I might get stuck, or that traditional linear thinking needs to be tweaked a little bit, or maybe augmented. And that's kind of like a rite of passage in the consulting world, is realizing that consulting is not just a science, but it's also an art. So somebody who really brings this to life is Peter Block, who wrote Flawless Consulting. It's a fantastic book, and it paints a whole journey of resistance, so that you can sort of anticipate what you'll encounter. And also just really good to have on the top of your mind. And I'll include a little link to that book chapter. So what I did was I took some liberty of summarizing and assigning these specific phases of consulting that we're using for specifically classic consultants and change agents. A lot of you are learning that um, these phases to consulting or OD consulting in this program, but how we suit them or alter them to fit the work of AI practitioners. So phase one, we always think about entry and sensing in the client system. Even if you're, an internal OD consultant and you're working with internal clients, there's always this phase of entry and sensing what's going on. And here, if you look at the Peter Block chapter, we might face what's called the impracticality defense. And this is where the client hints that you're living in an academic bubble and implying that your methods don't align with their real world. And then there's the eerie silence where feedback is sort of from them is sort of rare as a unicorn, and you're left wondering if you're right on track where you're supposed to be. So this entry and sensing phase, you're already encountering a cloud of resistance, typically. And that's something that you might anticipate. Doesn't happen all the time, but it's important because you're getting a degree from Penn State or a certificate, and so you are learning stuff that does have academic jargon. So phase two, contracting. So developing a contract with the client, the timing objection arises at this phase often. So suddenly the stars aren't aligning for the client, or you've been put on pause, or there's like the pressing need for solutions even before you diagnose the problem. It's like being asked for a prescription before the checkup, if that makes any sense. And then phase three, which is about data collection and analysis, this is this is the classic way of doing OD. If you've ever felt like you're being buried under an avalanche of details, they call this client flooding with detail. Or conversely, they might play hard to get and continually pushing for more detail. We want more detail, right? So lawyers are really notorious for this. They can flood you with detail, or they can ask for almost too much detail before moving forward. And that's an easy type of resistance. Not easy, it's a difficult type of resistance in the data collection and analysis part of consulting. Phase 4 usually is the feedback, right? So again, in the classic approach, you've got the data, you analyze the data, you're, you know, providing the feedback, and then you'll get, people who are playing it cool, right? Hey, I'm not surprised by that, right? Those insights aren't surprising to me. I kind of knew that. But doing it in a way that kind of undermines your insights. Others can also go on the offensive and actually attack and question your methodology for data collection. Just think about the deficit mindset there, right? Going after what they think is lacking. The truth is most of the clients I've had over the years are really not well versed in data collection and analysis. So part of dealing with folks at this stage is kind of preempting it and educating them on methodology and why it works. All right, so phase 5, action planning and closure. So as the curtain sort of drops, there's oftentimes a confusion tactic, the subtle compliance where they nod, but they don't really align, or the flight into health. Right? All of a sudden we're healthy and all the problems magically sort of vanish, right? So this is something that you can expect. It might not happen, and if it doesn't happen, that's great. But it's something that often does happen. Something to keep in mind. So if you think about this whole labyrinth of resistance, how do you channel the power of appreciative inquiry as a classic practitioner or even an innovative practitioner? Well, instead of getting bogged down by negativity, what we do is we flip the script, right? So past experiences like that group project that we talked about a little earlier, they could be reframed. So the discovery phase could involve digging deep into what went right, even if it was a tiny aspect, and then building on that. Clients like nothing more than talking about what they do right. And if you are sharing feedback through survey results, you can also broaden the discussion by discussing the flip side of what we think of as negative results, right? So, what do we see here? They look like negative results, but what positive do we see here? What is present that is positive? Peter Block does a good job about talking about that in virtually all of his texts. And even in these cases, there's a catch, because there's something called negativity bias. And some of you are probably already familiar with that, where past unpleasant experiences with consultants and skepticism towards change or even change management make your journey even more challenging. That type of resistance it's not just about reluctance. It's often rooted in past traumas in the organization, and skepticism. It's, change has been managed poorly for decades in organizations. So what's the antidote? Peter Block shares a really golden nugget of wisdom in an immersive learning circle that I facilitated based on a new case in his very latest edition of Flawless Consulting, his book. And so when faced with adamant resistance, Peter Block says, just respond with something like, what I'm hearing you say is that you're absolutely against the initiative. But then make it personal and you say, hey, would you do me at least a favor and come to one of our sessions, or have coffee with me? Just one. That's all I ask. Right. And so instead of challenging the resistance, coming into an appreciative mindset is an invitation. And they might not get you come and meet with you, but oftentimes I've found it's if you sit down with an individual who is a resistor, they'll first of all they'll be curious. They'll be curious why are we sitting down? It's really about building trust, right? Like one coffee at a time. I actually just did this with an employee in a government organization client of mine who this employee basically drove me crazy and drives everybody else crazy. But it was actually really hard for that employee to say no to coffee in front of others. And once I sat down with him, I realized that I didn't know that much, right? I actually learned some of the things that people were thinking, but they were too nice to mention. And by listening and actively addressing those things, the person I was having coffee with realized I was coming at this change in good faith. So change work there's an art to it, right? So for more insights, I'm going to also leave a blog article I wrote about my experience with Peter Block, and put a link in the announcement to class as well. All right, let's keep things brewing. And thanks again for listening.